The moment my office badge flashed red instead of green, I knew the game was over. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Carl, whom I had shared coffee with every morning for nearly 2 decades, refused to meet my gaze. He stared down at his desk, his voice barely above a whisper, as he told me my building access had been deactivated. I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand an explanation. Carl looked genuinely pained. I remembered when his youngest daughter was in the hospital years ago, and I had quietly covered his weekend shifts so he could be with his family. Now, he was forced to treat me like a trespasser. After 18 years of giving my life to Apex Dynamics, I knew exactly how corporate politics worked. I simply walked around to the loading dock entrance, slipped inside behind a delivery courier who was bringing office supplies, and made my way to my cubicle one last time to collect my thoughts. The office was quiet at 8 o'clock in the morning. Every workstation, every flashing light on the server racks, and every line of code running on the company dashboard was something I had built, debugged, or maintained. I looked at the server room through the glass partition. The air conditioning hummed, cooling the massive racks of processors that kept our client portals online. I had spent countless nights sleeping on a cheap cot in that very room, surviving on black coffee and cold pizza, just to ensure that our operations never went offline during critical system migrations. Just 3 hours before my arrival, at 5 o'clock in the morning, I had woken up to an automated alert warning of a critical memory leak in our database. I had logged in from my kitchen table, patched the leak, and saved the company from a catastrophic outage before eating breakfast. As usual, no one noticed, and no one thanked me. To the executives on the top floor, I was simply an expense line on a spreadsheet, a ghost in the machine. At exactly 9 o'clock, my manager sent me a brief calendar invite for a meeting in the main conference room. When I walked in, I found Brandon Vance, our newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, sitting at the head of the mahogany table. Brandon was 28 years old, wore tailored suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and happened to be the son-in-law of our Chief Executive Officer, George Higgins. Brandon had spent his first 3 weeks at the company talking about synergy, lean restructuring, and cutting unnecessary overhead. He had never written a single line of code in his life, yet he spoke with the absolute confidence of a man who believed his family connection was a reflection of his own business intelligence. In his hand, he held a slide deck detailing a new operational strategy, showing charts that highlighted the immediate cost savings of outsourcing our engineering department to a cheap offshore team. Brandon did not invite me to sit down. Instead, he slid a thick white envelope across the polished wood table. He flashed a practiced, synthetic smile that did not reach his eyes, and began speaking about the changing landscape of the technology sector, the need for agile operations, and the decision to outsource our software maintenance. He explained that my role as Chief Systems Architect was being eliminated as part of their new efficiency drive. After nearly 2 decades of absolute loyalty, I was being handed a severance package of 4 weeks of pay in exchange for signing away my rights to sue the company. I looked at the document. It was a standard release of claims, written in dense legal jargon designed to intimidate. Brandon watched me closely, his hands clasped over his expensive gold watch, expecting me to break down, argue, or beg for my job. He expected the panic of a 48-year-old man who had suddenly lost his livelihood. Instead, I felt a strange, cold wave of calm wash over me. I folded the letter, slipped it into my briefcase, and looked Brandon dead in the eye. I told him I understood his position and wished him the best of luck with the transition. Brandon seemed taken aback by my lack of emotion. He reminded me that my company laptop and badge had to be surrendered immediately, and that I had until noon to clear out my desk. I nodded, stood up, and walked out of the conference room. As I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box, my colleagues watched in silence. Their eyes filled with the fear of knowing they could be next. No one said goodbye, and no one walked me to the elevator. They were too afraid of being seen associating with a marked man. When I walked out of the glass doors of the headquarters, the autumn air was cool and crisp. I carried my box to my truck, placed it on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes. I looked up at the building, realizing that the people inside truly believed they had just disposed of another quiet, compliant employee. They had no idea that they had just pulled the pin on a grenade that would destroy their entire operation. They thought they had fired a systems engineer, but they had actually terminated their only access to the foundation of their business. As I drove home, I did not feel anger. I felt the quiet anticipation of a chess player who had spent years setting up the board, waiting for his opponent to make the one fatal move that would guarantee checkmate. When I arrived at my small, quiet house in the suburbs, I did not head to the kitchen or the living room. Instead, I went straight to the basement, where I had set up a private server room and office that was completely independent of my work at Apex Dynamics. I sat down at my desk, booted up my personal laptop, and looked at the clean, glowing monitors. The basement was cool, filled with the soft hum of cooling fans and the blinking amber lights of my own backup drives. Cable management was meticulous, with blue and gray Ethernet cables neatly bundled and routed along the walls. This was the space where my career had actually begun. Before I was ever a corporate employee, I was a creator. The executives at the office only knew me as Harvey Thorne, the quiet systems architect who kept their databases running. They had no idea that I carried another name, and with it, a piece of paper that held the power to bring their entire multi-million-dollar enterprise to its knees. My legal name at birth was Harvey Sinclair. I had lived under that name for the first 33 years of my life. 15 years ago, after my biological father passed away, my stepfather, Lawrence Thorne, who had raised me since I was a young boy and had been a true father to me in every sense of the word, legally adopted me. To honor him and the name he had given me, I legally changed my last name to Thorne. My employee records, payroll tax forms, and office badge at Apex Dynamics were all updated to show my new name, Harvey Thorne. To George Higgins and the rest of the board of directors, Harvey Sinclair had vanished from the earth, replaced by a loyal, silent engineer who did his job without complaint. But Sinclair Technologies, the sole proprietorship I had registered 22 years ago when I was 26, remained active. It was under Sinclair Technologies that I had spent 3 years of my youth developing a proprietary database routing engine called CoreFlow. CoreFlow was a highly specialized piece of software that solved the complex problem of data congestion in high-volume enterprise systems. It was incredibly efficient, routing millions of transactions per second with zero latency. I had spent countless weekends coding, testing, and optimizing every line of code, ensuring that the architecture was absolutely flawless. When Apex Dynamics hired me 18 years ago, they were struggling with severe system stability issues that threatened to bankrupt them. I realized that my proprietary software could solve all their problems. However, I was smart enough not to sell the software to them. I had watched too many talented developers sign away their life's work for a flat fee, only to be discarded once the company got what it wanted. Instead, 17 years ago, I entered into a formal software licensing agreement with the company. The contract was signed between Apex Dynamics and Sinclair Technologies, represented by its sole proprietor, Harvey Sinclair. Because the company was small at the time and desperate for a solution, George Higgins signed the agreement without running it through a team of corporate lawyers. He only cared that the software worked, and he was happy to pay the modest monthly license fee of $12,000. He was so relieved to have his systems running that he shook my hand and promised me that the company would always take care of me. Buried deep within that licensing agreement, under Section 9, Clause 4, was a provision that I had written myself to protect my intellectual property. The clause stated in clear, unambiguous language that the software license was strictly non-transferable and was contingent upon the active, undisturbed employment of the creator, Harvey Sinclair, at Apex Dynamics. The contract specified that in the event of the involuntary termination of the creator without cause, the license would automatically and immediately terminate, and all proprietary encryption keys would expire within exactly 48 hours of the notice of termination. For 17 years, that contract had sat in a dusty physical folder in the company's archives, forgotten by everyone except me. The monthly license fees were paid automatically from a legacy software maintenance account, and because The amount was relatively small compared to their growing revenue. No one ever questioned it. But now, Brandon Vance's arrogance had triggered the trap. I had been fired without cause, and the clock was ticking. I opened my email client, drafted a formal notice of license revocation, and attached a scanned copy of the original agreement. I signed the document using my birth name, Harvey Sinclair, as the sole proprietor of Sinclair Technologies. I carbon-copied my personal attorney, Sarah Jenkins, and sent the email directly to the head of the legal department and the executive suite at Apex Dynamics. As soon as the email was marked as delivered, I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and took a slow sip of my coffee. The 48-hour countdown had officially begun. They had exactly 2 days before the heart of their system stopped beating. I knew their legal team would spend the first few hours in complete confusion, searching for a man named Harvey Sinclair in their employee database, only to find nothing. The realization of what they had done would hit them slowly, and by then, it would be far too late to stop the cascade of system failures that was about to begin. By the following morning, the atmosphere at the Apex Dynamics headquarters had shifted from triumphant corporate restructuring to sheer panic. When my notice of license revocation arrived in the email inbox of the General Counsel, it was initially dismissed as a prank. A junior lawyer searched the active employee directory for a man named Harvey Sinclair and, finding no match, assumed it was a scam. However, as the legal team pulled the physical files from their storage, they located the original licensing agreement signed 17 years ago by George Higgins himself. The room fell silent as they read the clear, ironclad terms. They did not own the CoreFlow database engine. They had merely licensed it, and by firing Harvey Thorne, they had triggered the automatic termination of that license. The physical document was yellowed with age, stored in a dusty blue folder labeled Legacy System Assets, bearing the original blue ink signature of George Higgins from a time when the company was just a struggling startup operating out of a leased warehouse. Brandon Vance was furious. He called an emergency meeting of the engineering team, demanding that they simply remove the licensing check from the code. The lead systems engineer, Roger Croft, sat in the meeting room, his face pale as he looked at the whiteboard. Roger had worked under me for 6 years, and he understood the complexity of the architecture. He explained to Brandon that CoreFlow was not a simple library that could be bypassed. It was the database routing engine that connected every client dashboard, every transaction ledger, and every data pipeline in the company. The software utilized a proprietary public-private key pair, with the licensing key generated dynamically by an external server that only I controlled. Without this verification, the entire database architecture would refuse to process new data queries. Roger explained that the software was designed to contact my external licensing server every 12 hours to fetch a cryptographically signed authorization token. If the server returned a signed revocation notice, or if it failed to receive a valid response within a rolling 48-hour window, CoreFlow would automatically trigger its safety protocols. The software would clean up its active memory cache, lock down all database tables to prevent data corruption, and terminate all active database connection pools. Roger warned Brandon that any attempt to modify the binary code or bypass the cryptographic validation would trigger an automated lockdown. The database would immediately isolate itself, shutting down all active server connections and potentially corrupting terabytes of active client data. In short, attempting to hack my software would destroy their entire business overnight. Brandon screamed at Roger, accusing him of incompetence, and demanded that they find a workaround, but Roger simply shook his head. He told Brandon that I had designed the software to be tamper-proof, using advanced encryption standards that would take a supercomputer decades to crack. The clock was ticking, and they had less than 30 hours remaining before the dynamic keys expired, and the systems went dark. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification showed Brandon's name. I let it ring to voicemail. A few minutes later, my phone rang again, this time showing the office number for George Higgins. I answered, putting the call on speaker. George's voice came through first, sounding tired and defeated. He tried to appeal to my 18 years of loyalty, talking about the early days of the company, and how we had built it together from the ground up. But before I could respond, Brandon interrupted, his voice filled with a tense, artificial warmth. He told me that my termination had been a major misunderstanding, a simple administrative error during a routine corporate audit. He offered me my job back immediately, along with a promotion to Vice President of Infrastructure. He promised to increase my salary from $140,000 a year to $420,000 a year, along with a handsome signing bonus of $50,000. However, my attorney Sarah Jenkins was sitting across from me, and she had already reviewed the formal written offer they had emailed over. The proposed contract was a trap. While it offered a high salary, it contained a clause requiring me to transfer all intellectual property rights of CoreFlow to Apex Dynamics for a nominal fee of $1. It also required me to fully document the system and spend a 90-day transition period training 3 offshore junior engineers who would eventually replace me. They wanted to buy my software for a pittance, use me to train my replacements, and then fire me again once they had complete control. Sarah took the phone and spoke in a cold, professional tone. She informed Brandon that the offer was rejected. She stated that Apex Dynamics was currently in material breach of the original licensing agreement and that any continued use of CoreFlow after the 48-hour window would constitute willful copyright infringement. Brandon lost his temper, his voice cracking over the speaker as he yelled that I was sabotaging the company and that they would sue me for every penny I had. He screamed that I was holding their clients hostage and that our actions were illegal. Sarah calmly replied that we welcomed any legal action they wished to bring, as our contract was completely valid, and then she disconnected the call. I looked at the countdown timer on my laptop. We were down to 24 hours, and I could already see the first signs of system degradation on the public status page of Apex Dynamics. The latency times were rising, and their clients were starting to notice the slowdowns in their daily reports. With less than 20 hours remaining on the countdown, Apex Dynamics attempted to use the legal system as a shield. Brandon Vance, desperate to save his reputation and his father-in-law's company, hired a prestigious corporate law firm to file an emergency injunction in federal court. They accused me of extortion, breach of contract, and holding the company's proprietary systems hostage. They demanded that the court force me to hand over the master encryption keys and the source code for CoreFlow immediately. Brandon believed that a judge would side with a multi-million-dollar corporation over a single disgruntled former employee. He was about to receive a very expensive lesson in federal intellectual property law. My attorney, Sarah Jenkins, was fully prepared for their assault. She immediately filed a comprehensive counter-motion, presenting a wall of legal documentation that left the company's lawyers with no room to maneuver. Our first and most powerful weapon was Title 17 United States Code, Section 106. Under federal copyright law, Sinclair Technologies held the exclusive rights to the CoreFlow software. Sarah presented the original licensing agreement, which clearly stated that the license was contingent on my employment as Harvey Sinclair. The company's lawyers tried to argue that, because the employee directory only listed a Harvey Thorne, the contract with Harvey Sinclair was invalid or had been abandoned. They even accused me of fraud, claiming I had deliberately hidden my name change to trick the company. Sarah anticipated this weak argument. She produced the certified adoption decree and the legal name change petition from 15 years ago, proving that Harvey Sinclair and Harvey Thorne were the exact same individual. She pointed out that Apex Dynamics had accepted my tax forms, wage statements, and health insurance applications containing my legal name, Harvey Thorne, for 15 years, without once auditing their own software licensing records. This was a clear failure of their own administrative hygiene, not fraud on my part. The license was revoked because they had terminated me without cause, and any continued operation of the software would constitute willful copyright infringement. The statutory damages for willful infringement could reach up to $150,000 per day, and Sarah made sure the judge knew it. Furthermore, we cited Title 35, United States Code, Section 271, regarding patent infringement. I had patented the core routing algorithms under Sinclair Technologies 21 years ago, and those patents were still active and valid. Apex Dynamics had no legal right to run my algorithms without a license. Sarah also introduced a separate filing directed to the company's board of directors, accusing Brandon Vance of a gross breach of fiduciary duty. She argued that Brandon, as an officer of the corporation, had failed to perform basic due diligence before executing his restructuring plan. By firing the chief architect without reviewing the software contracts, Brandon had engaged in a reckless dissipation of corporate assets, exposing the company and its shareholders to catastrophic financial ruin. But Sarah was not finished. During her investigation of Brandon's recent corporate actions, she uncovered another massive violation. In his haste to cut costs and show immediate profitability, Brandon had also quietly laid off 40 administrative and technical support staff members across their regional offices on the very same day I was terminated. Brandon's lawyers tried to claim these individuals were merely independent contractors, but Sarah presented evidence of their set working hours, company email accounts, and direct supervision, proving they were legally employees. He had laid them off without providing the mandatory 60-day advance written notice required under the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the Warnin Act, under Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101. Under the Warnin Act, the company would be liable for back pay and benefits for all 40 employees for the entire 60-day period, plus a civil penalty of $500 for each day of violation. Sarah immediately contacted the representatives of those terminated employees, helping them initiate a class action lawsuit against Apex Dynamics. The federal judge reviewed the filings during an emergency hearing late that afternoon. Brandon and his team of lawyers sat on one side of the courtroom, looking confident, while Sarah and I sat on the other. It took the judge less than 30 minutes to review the evidence. He looked at Brandon's legal counsel and asked them point blank how they expected to force a creator to license his proprietary, patented technology when the contract they had signed explicitly prohibited it. The judge denied the company's request for an emergency injunction, stating that Apex Dynamics had created its own emergency through poor management and a lack of due diligence. He warned them that if they continued to run CoreFlow past the 48-hour deadline, they would face immediate federal copyright and patent infringement lawsuits. The news of the court's decision spread rapidly. By the time we walked out of the courthouse, several major shareholders had already called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The company's stock price was beginning to slide, dropping 3% in after hours, trading as rumors of a total system shutdown began to leak to the financial press. Major clients were calling the executive office, demanding written guarantees that their services would not be interrupted. Brandon Vance, who had spent his career believing that power was inherited rather than earned, was finally beginning to understand that the law did not care who his father-in-law was. He had tried to play a game of corporate hardball with the man who had built the entire field, and he was running out of time. The final morning of the countdown arrived. Apex Dynamics had spent the night trying to find a way to replace CoreFlow, but their efforts were completely futile. To make matters worse, Brandon Vance had scheduled a massive presentation for 9 o'clock that morning with their largest prospective client, a multinational investment group that was preparing to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. Brandon, refusing to acknowledge the impending disaster, stood at the front of the executive boardroom, clicking through his slides. He confidently assured the investors that their technology was robust, secure, and entirely proprietary. He was sweating through his tailored suit, his hands slightly trembling as he clicked through projections of future growth. The investors looked increasingly skeptical, having noticed the system latency warning messages flashing on the company dashboard during his slides. He was determined to prove that the company did not need me, and that his restructuring plan was a massive success. At exactly 9:05 in the morning, 48 hours after I was handed my termination letter, the dynamic encryption keys expired. In the middle of Brandon's presentation, the main screen in the boardroom went black. A second later, A simple red warning message appeared in bold text. It stated that the CoreFlow software license had expired and directed the user to contact Sinclair Technologies for licensing inquiries. Simultaneously, every computer terminal, every client dashboard, and every automated database pipeline across the entire company froze. In the server room downstairs, the loud hum of active database operations suddenly dropped as the server processes shut down, replaced by a quiet, eerie silence. Junior engineers scrambled to run diagnostic commands, but their terminals only returned license validation errors. The investors stood up, looked at the screen, and then looked at Brandon, whose face had gone completely white. The presentation was over, and so was the contract. Within hours, the internal crisis was impossible to manage. With the entire system down, Apex Dynamics was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue every hour. The board of directors, realizing that Brandon's arrogance had led them into a legal and operational brick wall, called an emergency meeting. They did not invite George Higgins or his son-in-law. The board members were furious. The board chairman, Reginald Howard, a stern and experienced investor, confronted Brandon directly. Reginald's deep voice boomed in the room as he read out the findings of their emergency audit. He pointed out that Brandon's complete lack of technical understanding had exposed the company to federal copyright lawsuits, patent lawsuits, Warren Act violations, and the loss of 3 major clients in a single afternoon. The board voted unanimously to terminate Brandon Vance from his position as Chief Operating Officer immediately, stripping him of all corporate authority and removing him from the building. They also voted to initiate a lawsuit against him for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking to hold him personally liable for the dissipation of corporate assets and the massive financial damage caused by his lack of due diligence. Under intense pressure from the shareholders, George Higgins was forced to announce his immediate retirement from the company. The board of directors tried to contact me, sending desperate emails and offering to pay any licensing fee I demanded, but I had already moved on. I had no interest in returning to a company that only valued my work when it was gone. Instead, I focused on my own future. Using the licensing fees I had accumulated over the years, I registered Sinclair Insights and leased a beautiful new office suite in the financial district. I did not need to search for clients. Several of Apex Dynamics' largest former clients, having witnessed the total failure of the company's technology and learning that I owned the core routing engine, contacted me directly. They wanted to license CoreFlow from Sinclair Technologies and hire Sinclair Insights to manage their database architectures. A week after my termination, I unlocked the glass door to my new office. The name Sinclair Insights was printed on the glass in clean silver letters. I walked inside, set my briefcase on the desk, and looked out the window at the city skyline. I was 48 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was the sole master of my career. Roger Croft had resigned from Apex Dynamics the previous day, and he was already sitting at his new desk as my head of systems engineering. In addition, I had decided to hire 10 of the talented engineers who had been laid off by Brandon under his restructuring plan, giving them stable jobs with fair salaries and a collaborative working environment where their skills were respected. We had already secured 3 major contracts that would guarantee our profitability for the next 5 years. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and smiled. I had not sought revenge through illegal hacking or malicious sabotage. I had simply enforced the contract exactly as it was written. I had allowed the executives to face the natural consequences of their own arrogance. They had believed that my quiet dedication was a sign of weakness, and that they could dispose of me without any repercussions. They never understood that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and when they decided to erase my name, they had demolished their own future. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began to work on the next phase of my business, knowing that my value would never be ignored again.